All right, jumping into this rabbit hole of cholinergic receptors.
Uh-huh. That's
You
right.
sent over some seriously dense material, acetylcholine and the two main receptor types,
Yeah.
muscarinic and nicotinic.
Yeah.
We're going to try to unravel their roles in, well, everything.
Mm.
Thinking, memory, how your muscles even move, and even how your body keeps everything running in the background.
Yeah, you know what I think is so fascinating?
Hmm.
It's like we're talking about two totally different communication systems in your body,
Oh, okay.
but they're both triggered by the same neurotransmitter, acetylcholine.
Interesting.
One of them's like this carefully orchestrated symphony, and the other one's like a rapid-fire text message.
Okay, I am intrigued.
Uh,
But before we get into all of that, let's make sure everyone's on the same page here.
yeah.
Acetylcholine, that's our star player here, right?
Exactly. It's a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger. It lets all the neurons talk to each other and to other cells in the body too.
Uh-huh.
It's essential, I mean, for the nervous system to function at all.
Got it. So how does all of this relate to the spinal cord and glycine? You mentioned that in the notes.
Ah, yes. Glycine, that's the main inhibitor in the spinal cord, like a braking system for the muscles, you could say.
Okay, hold on. Isn't GABA the main inhibitor in the brain?
You're right, it is. GABA is primary in the brain, but down in the spinal cord. It's glycine's show.
Oh, interesting.
It's critical for regulating muscle contractions. Just imagine, like, you want to move your arm,
Okay.
so your brain's got to send a signal down the spinal cord to those motor neurons that control your arm muscles.
Okay, so far so good.
But then at the same time, glycine is released onto those motor neurons.
Right.
And that's what stops them from overfiring. So it's this balance between excitation and inhibition, and that's what lets you move smoothly and have control.
So it's like a dance between like opposing forces almost.
Exactly.
I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah.
So how does acetylcholine fit into all of this?
Well, that's where our two receptor types come in, muscarinic and nicotinic. Both activated by acetylcholine, but their mechanisms are so different. It's like getting a message in two completely different formats.
Okay, let's break it down then. Muscarinic receptors first. What makes them so special?
Well, muscarinic receptors, they're like diplomats, in the cell world. They work through this complex pathway, involves G proteins and second messengers. Slower, it's a much more intricate process, but it allows for a wider range of effects.
So they're the ones that are in charge of the like the rest and digest
Yeah.
functions. That's the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Like slowing down the heart rate, increasing digestion.
Precisely. All about maintaining that calm, steady state in your body,
Makes sense.
fine-tuning that internal environment.
All right, so muscarinic receptors, they're the slow and steady type. What about their counterpart? Nicotinic receptors, they sound a little more intense.
Oh, yeah, they are. Nicotinic receptors are the splinters. They're ion channels, so they directly change the electrical potential of the cell, leading to those rapid responses.
So they're the ones that are responsible for like the lightning fast muscle contractions. Like if you pull your hand away from a hot stove.
Exactly. Every voluntary muscle movement, every single one you make, relies on nicotinic receptors.
Hmm.
It's at the neuromuscular junction, where the nerves connect to your muscles.
Wow.
Also crucial for certain brain functions, like attention and learning.
It's incredible. So it's like you have two separate communication networks, and they're running in parallel,
That's right.
both being controlled by acetylcholine.
And remember that example from the materials you sent me? About the heart muscle cells, the cardiomyocytes?
Yeah.
It really highlights that whole concept of microdomains.
Right. So the beta-1 adrenergic receptor
Yeah.
in cardiomyocytes, it increases contractility, right?
Yeah.
When it's stimulated by adrenaline.
Right.
But then you have the EP4 receptor. That one's coupled to Gs and activates cyclic AMP,
Right.
but it doesn't increase contractility.
Exactly.
It just doesn't make sense if we think of cyclic AMP signaling as global within a cell.
The classical view of cyclic AMP just spreading evenly throughout the cell, it just doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
And that's where that idea of microdomains comes in.
So instead of this general broadcast, it's more like targeted messages delivered to specific locations within the cell.
Precisely. It's like having different departments within a company, and they each respond to very specific instructions. Microdomains allow for incredibly fine-tuned control over all of the cell processes.
Okay, and this is where those AKAPs come into play, right?
Yes.
The akinase anchoring proteins.
Exactly. AKAPs, they're like the organizers of these microdomains.
Okay.
They anchor protein kinase A, which is a key enzyme in cyclic AMP signaling, to specific locations, so it makes sure the signal gets delivered to the right place at the right time.
Hold on. Protein kinase A, there are different types of this, right? Type 1 and type 2. And they bind to AKPs differently. And what is this amphipathic helix? I read about that.
You're right, there are different types of protein kinase A, and they do bind to AKPs differently. It adds another layer of specificity to the whole signaling process. And that amphipathic helix you mentioned,
Yeah.
that's a key structural feature of AKPs. It's like a spiral staircase, you know? One side loves water, the other side avoids it.
Oh, wow.
This lets them anchor protein kinase A in close proximity to its target molecules, all within that microdomain.
Wow. This is getting complex.
Right.
But I think I'm starting to see how it all kind of fits together. So we've got acetylcholine acting as a messenger, right?
Right.
And these two different types of receptors, muscarinic and nicotinic,
Right.
they control all these different aspects of our physiology.
Right.
And then you have these microdomains adding yet another layer of complexity and specificity to the whole signaling process.
Exactly. And it's this complexity that makes the cholinergic system so fascinating and so important to understand how our bodies work. Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive.
Into the world of cholinergic receptors.
Right. And their connection to Alzheimer's disease.
It is mind-blowing, I gotta say.
It is.
To think that these tiny receptors, muscarinic and nicotinic, have so much power over brain function.
And as we were discussing before, it's not just the receptors themselves,
Yeah.
it's that whole web of signaling pathways that they're involved in, particularly with Alzheimer's disease.
Right. You mentioned earlier that the loss of cholinergic neurons, that's a hallmark of Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
But it's not just the number of neurons that are affected, is it?
Right.
What about, like, their connections?
That's a crucial point, for sure. It's not just the number of neurons, it's how well they can communicate with each other. In Alzheimer's, we see a disruption in those connections,
Okay.
the synapses.
So it's like a city where the roads and communication lines are breaking down.
Yeah.
So it's harder to get information around.
That's a perfect analogy. The synaptic connections, they're essential, right, for transmitting signals between neurons.
Yeah.
And when they get disrupted, communication in the brain breaks down.
Yeah.
And that contributes to the decline we see in Alzheimer's patients, right?
Mhm.
Affecting memory, language, problem solving, even those basic daily tasks.
Yeah. It's just heartbreaking to think about, really, the impact this must have on individuals and families.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that researchers are looking at ways to target those cholinergic receptors as like a potential treatment.
Right.
Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. One of the promising things we're looking at is inhibiting the enzyme
Yeah.
that breaks down acetylcholine.
Okay.
It's called acetylcholinesterase.
Got it.
So if we can block this enzyme, that means we can increase the levels of acetylcholine in the brain
Makes sense.
and hopefully boost that remaining cholinergic signaling.
So it's kind of like you're preventing the city's sanitation department from removing all those vital communication cables.
Exactly. And there are actually drugs available that do this already.
Oh, wow.
They're called cholinesterase inhibitors.
Oh.
They can offer some relief from the symptoms,
Mhm.
but they don't actually address the root cause of the disease
Yeah.
or stop it from progressing.
So what about, like, directly activating the cholinergic receptors? Is that a possibility?
Yes, it is. That's another big area of research. Scientists are working on drugs that can bind to and activate the receptors,
Yeah.
right? They're muscarinic or nicotinic.
Mhm.
It's like trying to mimic what acetylcholine does.
So it's like installing new high-tech communication systems to
Mhm.
bypass the damaged ones.
That's the idea, but it's not that straightforward. I mean, there are all these different subtypes of muscarinic and nicotinic receptors,
Mhm.
and each one has its own distribution and function in the brain.
Yeah. So researchers need to be pretty precise, huh?
Oh, yeah.
When targeting those subtypes.
If you don't target the right ones,
Yeah.
you get all these unintended side effects.
So it's like you're trying to deliver a package to a certain apartment, but you have this massive building. You got to get the right address, the right key.
Right, and even then,
Yeah.
there's always a risk that that package ends up in the wrong hands.
That's a great analogy. So it
Yeah.
sounds like there are a lot of challenges
Yeah.
to developing treatments for Alzheimer's.
There are a lot of challenges, definitely. But there's also a lot of hope.
Uh,
Research is moving so fast, and we're starting to understand more about how complex the cholinergic system is and its role in Alzheimer's disease.
It's encouraging to hear that. But what about, like, non-drug approaches? Are there any, like, lifestyle things
That's a great question.
that can affect acetylcholine levels or protect against cognitive decline?
There is growing evidence that lifestyle can play a big role in brain health. Things like regular exercise, a healthy diet
Yeah.
full of antioxidants,
Mm-hmm.
and doing mentally stimulating activities,
Okay.
all of those have been shown to have positive effects on cognitive function.
So it's not just about finding the right medication.
Right.
It's about taking a holistic approach to brain health.
Exactly. It's like nurturing your brain throughout life like you would any other organ.
This deep dive, I got to say, it's really opened my eyes to how intricate
It is.
the cholinergic system is.
Right.
And just how important it is
Absolutely.
for brain function.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover about this system.
I'm ready to hear more. What other insights do you have for us in part 3? Back again for our deep dive into the cholinergic system.
That's right.
It's amazing how these tiny receptors, muscarinic and nicotinic,
Yeah.
play a role in so many things, muscle movement to memory.
Yeah.
It really is incredible.
It is a remarkable system, that's for sure. And as we talked about before, it's not just working by itself. Right. The cholinergic system, it interacts with all these other neurotransmitter systems in the body, like this big communication web.
So it's not just acetylcholine calling the shots.
Right.
It's more of a team effort, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. Think of it like an orchestra.
Yeah.
With acetylcholine as one of the key instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got dopamine, serotonin, GABA. They all work together to make this beautiful symphony of brain activity.
I love that analogy. So acetylcholine is part of this bigger conversation that's happening in the brain.
It is.
Can you give me like an example of how it interacts with another neurotransmitter?
Sure. Let's think about dopamine. That's the neurotransmitter that's all about reward and motivation.
Right.
So in certain areas of the brain, acetylcholine can actually increase dopamine release, but in other areas, it can inhibit it.
So the same neurotransmitter can have like opposite effects.
Yeah.
Depending on where it is.
Exactly. It all depends on the location and what other players are involved. Wow.
And, this back and forth between these neurotransmitter systems, that's what highlights how sensitive that balance in the brain really is.
Yeah.
If one system gets messed up, it can have these ripple effects.
Makes sense.
On the whole network.
Like a delicate ecosystem.
Yeah, like if one species gets disrupted, the whole thing's thrown off balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and this is why understanding these interactions, it's so important for coming up with new treatments for all sorts of things, neurological disorders, psychiatric disorders.
Well, in part 2, you were talking about how research is exploring acetylcholine's potential as a treatment for things besides Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Can you give me like some specific example?
Of course. One thing we're looking at is using cholinergic drugs to treat addiction.
Okay.
Like we talked about, acetylcholine can affect dopamine release, right?
Right.
And that's a big player in that reward pathway that drives addiction.
So if we can somehow manipulate the acetylcholine signaling,
could we actually make those cravings and rewards less powerful?
That's the hope. Some studies are actually showing pretty promising results using these drugs called nicotinic receptor agonists. Those are drugs that activate nicotinic receptors.
Okay.
And they've actually been able to reduce cravings for things like nicotine and cocaine.
That's incredible. Are there other areas where these cholinergic drugs are being investigated?
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of interest in using them for cognitive disorders beyond Alzheimer's. For example, some researchers are looking at using cholinesterase inhibitors, the ones that block the breakdown of acetylcholine to help improve attention and memory in people with traumatic brain injuries.
So boosting acetylcholine levels, it could actually help repair or compensate for damage from the injury.
That's the idea, yeah. And there's even some early evidence that cholinergic drugs might be helpful for schizophrenia and ADHD, too.
Wow, the possibilities are really exciting.
It is an exciting field, for sure.
To see how all this research is uncovering the therapeutic potential of this essential neurotransmitter system.
It is, and it's important to keep in mind that this research is still going on. There's so much more we need to learn about how complex the cholinergic system is and how we can really harness its power to help people.
Well, this deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. I mean, the complexity and the interconnectedness of the cholinergic system is just remarkable.
It's been a pleasure exploring this all with you. I hope you've gained a new appreciation for how incredible the brain is and all these intricate pathways that shape our lives.
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey, from the basics of neurotransmission to all this cutting-edge research.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's still so much more to learn.
You know, the great thing about science is that it's this ongoing search for knowledge.
Yeah.
And every new thing we discover just opens up even more avenues to explore.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into the cholinergic system. We've really uncovered a lot of information, from how the acetylcholine receptors work at the molecular level to the potential these cholinergic drugs have for treating all sorts of disorders.
And remember, the discovery doesn't stop here.
Yeah,
There's always more to learn, more to explore,
right.
and more to understand about this amazing world that's inside all of us.
I couldn't agree more. Until next time, keep those synapses firing and never stop learning.
And never stop asking questions. That's the important thing.
That's right.
That search for knowledge, it's an adventure that never really ends.